Hello, everyone, and welcome to Portrait of a Lady. This is Portrait of a Lady. She's a show dog, so she has a fancy name, but her regular day name is Isabel, and I named her because of this novel. But I thought you'd like to see it just as an introduction. This is the first installment of our series studying the novel. I'm going to now go and put her back because she's not that interested in sitting on my lap right now. 1 minute. So I'm back. Those of you who know me know that my other interest is my dogs. So, and if you're an English teacher, you name your dogs after characters in books. And that was Isabel. Anyway, we're going to start today. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. Because of the bulk of the novel, we're not going to be able to go page by page, line by line. There's just so much material. But I do have enough. There's just a vast amount of information about Portrait and about Henry James. So I'm going to start giving you some information that I think will help you understand James and the creation of his character Isabel. So we're going to start with with the introduction to the novel, written by Leon Edel, a very important critic, and some of what he has to say shines some light on what we're doing. Um, the Portrait of a Lady, he says, represented the new realism which George Eliot had introduced into the English novel. I'll get to George Eliot in a minute. Henry James went so much farther than she in his realism that he recognized now as one of the principal architects, not to say builders, of the modern novel. The interesting thing about Edel using the word architect is how Henry James uses architecture in the novel itself. Those of you who know my system, I like to establish the context of a writer on the first day. I'm not even sure we're going to get to the novel today, probably not. But the context for Henry James is so important in the development of our character. The writers of fiction before George Eliot and Henry James had been instinctive. Um, they were instinctive novelists who created not out of their conscious minds, but out of their hearts and their imaginations. Whereas George Eliot and then Henry James created the characters specifically to create a picture of their realistic point of view. Let's see. George Eliot was analytical and meditative. Her mind tended to move from the particular to the general. Henry James brought quite a different originality to the novel. At once less intellectual and philosophic than his English predecessor, he tended to move from the general to the particular. So that, if you're inclined to take notes, today what I'm going to try to do is establish some of the things that you should be looking for as you read, and this is one of them. Henry James moves from the general to the particular. George Eliot was concerned overtly with philosophical problems. James was concerned with artistic as well as ethical problems. Not only did he seek to make the novel convey reality, that's important, but he set himself to discovering the best techniques by which verisimilitude might be attained in the actual process of narration. Remember, and we'll get to this in a bit, James was great friends with William Dean Howells. So the importance of verisimilitude at this moment in the development of literature was key. His was a constant search for ways by which the storyteller might be, in Joyce's formulation, refined out of existence. So Henry James didn't want to be overtly involved in the narration of the story. In the end, we're going to see that we learn about Isabel less through James's narration and more through people's points of view about her, characters, about her. What do they say about her in their conversations, even if she isn't in the scene? Um, let's see, what else do I want to tell you? Um, James wrote, let's see, no, I don't want that. Here then, in anticipation of the portrait, written during the year of, Minnie Temple's death, we'll get to Minnie Temple too, she's really important. His memories of his cousin, his observation of American girls abroad, his vision of continental life, his friendship with such figures as Russell Sturgis of Baring Brothers, and his visits to the great houses of England. All of these things figure in Portrait of a Lady. It's an intensely um, not you can't say it's autobiographical, but he borrows things from his experience that appear in the text. Okay. Uh, Edel goes on to say Isabel Archer, who partakes of the reality, retains her uniqueness among them as a figure, as intensely American as they are European. So theirs have been largely dramas of passion. Isabel's drama has been, so to speak, a drama of suppressed passion and of blind self assertion, as well as the evil that can exist beneath the serene facade of life. Benign self assertion. This is the American contribution to the conflict that's going to exist between Americans and Europeans in Henry James's novels. So, as I said, that was from Leon Edel. I have a bit of biography here about Henry James. Um, if you want to see, this is one of my favorite pictures of him. It's really a really nice picture of him. There's some other ones that are kind of weird and make his face look a bit distorted, but that's a beautiful one. The conflict between the culture and manners of U.S. and European society presented itself as his natural subject. Now, I'll get to his biography in a second. The intimate side of James's life is obscure. Whether if he was gay, he concealed it, living an outward chaste life, but in his later years he experienced love with two younger men. Whether it was sexual is unknown. But that's always a question. Was he gay or was he not? Or how is that even relevant? It is relevant because he is looking um, at relationships as an outsider. He, of course, was an expatriate. I'll get to that as well. Um, uh, let's see. I think that's all. Oh, and one thing that is another relevant piece of information, just as a backdrop, and that's what we're doing right now, is his brother William. William was his younger brother by I think it was 15 months. So, but he was another great intellectual. Um, he was the eldest brother of Henry. Oh, he was the eldest one. Was an important philosopher and one of the founders of modern psychology. His work included the principles of psychology and the varieties of religious experience. In his lifetime, he was considered the more distinguished and successful of the two brothers. By the way, I don't know if you can hear that. That's Isabel barking. I'm probably going to have to put her in a crate. William James coined the term stream of consciousness, and this is why I'm even mentioning it, for the unbroken flow of thoughts in the mind. And this concept had a major influence on Henry James and his novels and on subsequent modernist fiction. We have surely seen that. We've seen it in James Joyce, but we are going to see that in Portrait of an Artist. I'm going to have to pause because my dog's barking. That's Isabel. She wants to participate apparently. 1 second. I'm back. Happily, I have figured out how to pause this video thing. I don't know if you remember from last semester, I kept stopping the video and then I'd have all of these videos that I would have to upload, but I think I've probably figured this out by now, thankfully. So anyway, what I'm doing here is trying to give you some background information that will prove relevant to the reading of the text. I have an article here by someone named Charlotte Thien. She's writing in a collection called Critical Insights. You've probably seen these. Um, she says in an article entitled Henry James and the Dilemma of Young Americans Abroad. It's exactly what we're talking about. As a writer of fiction, Henry James rarely fits into any neat category. In terms of national or regional cultural identity, this indefinability is particularly striking. Although he was born in New York and raised in a fashionable area, James is not exclusively an American writer. I'm sure you remember this from other James fiction, or if you were with me when we discussed Henry James and Portrait of an Artist many years ago, that he is somebody who is straddling American and European. And I have a book here that we'll get to that suggests how he developed into the writer that he is. He spent too much time abroad to hold on to his nationality in his published works. His style and his thematic preoccupations were far too strongly influenced by his distinctly European experiences. Um, his experiences as an American writer in a self-imposed exile from the country of his birth forces us to consider him not merely as an American writer, but an international and multicultural writer, a writer of blended national identity, captured both by American and by European culture. And this is the backdrop in which Isabel finds herself. The difficulty with James is particularly acute because he so actively considers the conflicts between American and European cultural identities. Another of James's central preoccupation was the way in which American culture and the United States sought to establish itself not only as a unifying force, forging a national identity, but also on the international stage in relation to other more established cultures and nationalities. We certainly have seen this in women who went off to Europe to marry in order to gain aristocratic titles, and European men would marry these women in order to acquire their wealth. So there was this conflict. James, in Portrait of a Lady, as you know, published between 1880 to 81, James juxtaposes American values with European ones to emphasize those very issues. He portrays the former as highly idealistic, romantic, and naive. That's Isabel. Highly idealistic, romantic, and naive, while the latter are dubiously materialistic and opportunistic. We'll see that, um, especially as we follow Isabel through her various relationships, we'll say. I'm going to try really hard not to give away the end of the novel because some of you I know follow the you read with me in the classes, and I don't want to give away the end of the novel because it's really good. Indeed, James often develops his characters and stories to emphasize Americans as being at a distinct disadvantage in European society. James views them not only as romantics and idealists, but also as victims, very literally out of their intellectual depth among Europeans. It is not simply a matter of relative weakness, though. Of Isabel Archer, one critic observes that she is not merely more democratic and freer, so write that too. All right. She's more democratic and more free than the Europeans whom she encounters. She is pure and more honest. If she is headstrong, naive, abrupt, even blunt, she is also shiningly, incontrovertibly good. This author, what's her name again? I forget. Um, Fiend is quoting someone named Auchincloss. We'll get to Eventually. I'll get to some of his materials as well. Part of James's reckoning of American versus European culture and national identities suggests that Americans' experience in Europe is, at least in part, a tragedy. James's American heroes and heroines in particular tend to be made unhappy or even done to death by a cynical, dirty-minded old Europe. That's interesting, isn't it? James maintained a clear notion of an international conflict centered around this problem. Is the problem ever solved? No, it's never solved. He continues to examine this. Even later on in Wings of the Dove, um, he developed it too as a struggle of good against evil, the brave new world against the wicked old, in several of his novels and short stories. But the problem isn't solved, and it isn't that simple. That's the conflict. But who represents what, we will see as we go. All right, so that I'm done. Well, I'm those of you who know me know that I'm just a little bit bananas about sticky notes. I love them. They just help me organize things so well. And I'm reading this book. If anyone is interested in reading something very interesting, a very complete discovery of Henry James himself, this book, Portrait of a Novel. Thank you, Jane, for recommending this to me. Written by Michael Gorra, Gorra. In it, he takes us through an examination of how Henry James came to be what he is, and how Portrait came to be the novel that it is. Let's see. Most 19th century novelists, he says, touched upon their work in the months between its first publication in a magazine and its appearance as a bound volume. This is important for Portrait because it was serialized in the first number of in the first couple of years, from 1880 to 81. It was serialized, and then he rewrote it. How many decades? 3 or 4 decades later. 3 decades. It was republished, and he retooled it. And there were a lot of significant changes to the text. We are looking at the serialized version from 1880 to 81. The version that he retooled in 1908 was a little bit different, and most people say that it was the serialized version that they are going to examine. A serial installment might have been rushed to make a deadline or trimmed to match the space, and its opening chapters were usually in print long before the book was finished. But Henry James took the business of revision much further than that. And this person goes on to say that when it was retooled, it was altered quite a bit. He was very, very meticulous. But this concept of serialization, I don't know if we looked at Dickens in a while. But Dickens, of course, was a master of serialization, and that's why his novels are so fat. You remember he's got those great big fat texts, like in Oliver Twist. He did not finish the novel before he began to serialize the first part of the novel. But Henry James was more meticulous. He believed that almost every sentence could stand a little work and could hardly bear to reread his earlier things except with his pen in his hand, making changes as he went. Um, The Portrait of a Lady, the novel in which, after a period of careful apprenticeship, he had first allowed his imagination full stretch. I don't know why that was important to me, but it was. The novel told the story of a girl, Isabel Archer, a girl who claims she's fond of her freedom. Write that down too. You will notice as you are reading, she frequently, I wouldn't say frequently, but she has many times mentioned her need for her freedom. And this is an American concept. Women didn't really have that. And Isabel, because she has been made an heiress by her aunt, she has a kind of freedom that other women didn't have. We've seen that in that collection of stories that we read about women who did. Isabel is one of them. At first, let's see, for she will soon make the mistake of her. Oh, I'm not going to tell you that. Oh, don't want to read that. Today, Portrait of a Lady appears to look backward and forward at once. Um, it is the link between George Eliot and Virginia Woolf. James used his heroine to crystallize one of his period's central concerns, that of which George Eliot herself had described as the delicate vessels of female experience. Isabel's story touched the limits of what could and couldn't be I lost my place, and couldn't be said about sex in the Anglo American fiction of the period. And James also flouted the conventions of his era by risking an ending. I'm not going to say the ending was open. I'm not going to say what the tone of it was. I'm really going to try not to give away the end of the novel. For its richly suggestive picture of what it is to be an American depends paradoxically on the way it uses both its European setting and the thematics of European fiction, the marriage plot, the novel of adultery, to mount a critique on American exceptionalism. Henry James can write about American exceptionalism because he is an expatriate. He had a peculiar upbringing. I'm going to just have to mark this. I usually don't use orange. Those of you who know me know that my other job is I run the school at the Ozaki County Jail, and people there, they wear orange. So orange isn't my favorite color anyway, but I happen to have these orange ones, and that tells me to go back to that page. That was just completely off the point. But I got to return to that. All right. So the second chapter of this book about Henry James by Gora is entitled A Native of No Country. And if you've read other expatriates, the way, like Hemingway, the way that the expatriates can examine Americanism is by seeing it as other. The only way that they can write about their native country is to be outside of it rather than immersed in it. Henry James traveled in Europe many times. Oh, that's right. In the beginning of your book is a detailed chronology, and I'm not going to read the whole chronology, it's pages long, but I am going to touch on things that are important to the development of Henry James as a writer. If you'll notice, he started traveling to Europe when he was 2 or 3 years old. Then the family returns to New York, and then the family returns to Europe, traveling to France and Switzerland. Um, Eventually, he comes back to America. He's going back and forth, and this process distances himself from the United States, from America. Um, One element of him is that his father was quite well to do. Um, his father's father had made a fortune. Henry James Sr. had inherited it, and because of that, the family lived well in society of New York. I'm sure you remember this from past examinations of their history. But one of the things that Henry James's father insisted on was that the boys, William and James, have professions. And William, Henry's brother, kind of danced around trying to figure it out. He could never land on any particular career. And Henry James didn't land on his career as a writer until a number of years later. He did try um, the lawyer route. He entered Harvard, as it says on the bottom of page, this chronology, which is not numbered. Oh, it's VII. He enters law school for a term, but this didn't really appeal to him. And simultaneously, he started submitting short stories, particularly to the Atlantic. He met William Dean Howells, an important friendship, in 1866. Now, Howells, of course, was I mentioned this a few minutes ago, the advocate for verisimilitude. And it says on the top of VII, he was a novelist, critic, and influential editor, and they became friends. About him. Market. The two of them often walked about together discussing things like plot and characterization. Um, Henry James is known to have subdued plot, as we see in the novel. Plot isn't as important as it had been, or simultaneously was important to Dickens. You remember Dickens had 10 plots going simultaneously. Not 10, but many. And then by the end of whatever book we were reading, they would all come together towards the end. This is not the way Henry James developed his plots. So he attended Harvard. It didn't appeal to him. He was writing many short stories, sending them on to Howells. Eventually, Howells became the primary editor of the Atlantic. Down at the bottom of this page, Henry James returned to France, where he met important philosophers and writers, including Flaubert, Turgenev, Zola, Maupassant, and he became part of their crowd. In fact, James learned French so fluently that a number of critics noticed that his speech takes on a French um, structure. I forget the word. So, anyway, towards the middle of page, it's 9 in Roman numerals. The novel's written in 1881, and I did I? Where did she go? Anyway, I'm going to let you read this. It's very detailed, and we really don't need to. Um, it's all there for you. There were some things that, as I said, his movement between America and Europe, and then his eventual transplant to England, played out in his ability to be other from his assessment of the conflict between Americans and Europeans philosophically. It's not like we were fighting or anything. So, the theme, I'm returning to the introduction of your textbook. The theme in this book is the young American in Europe, a young American woman in Europe. Play this against women who did, because this is the same kind concern. The portrait down at the bottom of this page, I'm on the first page of the introduction, right here. The portrait is partly responding to and finding a mode for its historical moment. The moment, of course, is post-Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865 in the midst of America's Gilded Age. So everybody was so happy to be out of the Civil War that there was an exploration. There was a bloom in philosophy, William James, and in scientific theory, and in industrialization. At a time of increasing industrialization and democratization, it represents a dialogue between Victorian certainties and modern doubts. That's relevant. You might want to start it. Um, I started this right there. You can see. I always try to get my college students to annotate. They don't. They never annotate. And then I ask them, so what did you think was interesting about this piece? And they have no idea because they didn't annotate it. I always tell them to write in their textbooks, but their modus operandi is to sell the book back at the end of the semester for $5. It's just not a very good way to be a student, but they're not going to be English majors anyway, so whatever. Um, there were many displacements, dealing as it does with displacements created by railways, steamships, and telegrams. Um, in this novel, printed here in the version of the text that would have been familiar to many of his early readers, James brings together in a fresh way different worlds, perspectives, traditions, and values, negotiating between what could be broadly seen as the European past of social fixity and hierarchy and the American future of industrial and territorial expansion. That is it's absolutely key to understanding Isabel Archer amongst her new European friends. A few lines later, excuse me, James's interest in the portrait, which has more sympathy than Johnson with romantic yearning and its aspiration, and the desire to live in some full or abstract sense, centers above on the place of the imagination in human life as one tries to find a path or a place in the world. It is Isabel's desire to live, and she reiterates this, and we'll see this as we go through the novel. Um, a temporal version of Johnson's disappointing lesson still applies in James, the meeting between the adventurous, inexperienced imagination, here embodied by Isabel, and the real finite world of the concrete, and the chillingly other can be a painful clash and a dangerous one. I think that's very astute because here we have this naive American who wants to live, who values her freedom in in a way that is similar to Benjamin Franklin, who defined the American personality, the American persona in his autobiography. He defined it in a way that had not been defined before. We see it a bit later again in Huckleberry Finn, where we have Huck going out and examining what it is to be free. This is an American point of view. We all value this. Um, let's see, at the top of page Roman numeral 15, her imagination, however, skews her interpretation of her world. It's her imagination. And we are given this point of view, the interior point of view of Isabel's thought processes. This is unique. Without the imagination, a few lines later, according to this novel, life has little meaning. For one thing, it is the medium of our relations with others. We cannot know their thoughts and feelings. We have sympathetically to imagine them. And I bet you can relate to this concept because you might think to yourself, in some sort of interaction with someone, I bet that person's thinking this of me. But we don't know. We can't know. The only way we can know about Isabel's personality is from other people's views of her. We get the benefit of seeing inside of her internally, but then we also get the different points of view on what other people think of her. And all of those facets become the way that we can understand her completely. Um, Down at the bottom of this paragraph on page XV 15, imagination sometimes allows you to see what others miss. At other times, it makes you see what isn't there. It plays tricks or lays traps. There is no escaping this paradox. That's an important point. It is a paradox. So we think we know Isabel, we think we understand her, we get the internal, and then other people show us different points. In undertaking the portrait, James was consciously pulling together many of his previous experiences in life and achievements in art. He also he was also drawing on intimate, treasured memories. Yeah, look over on page XVI 16. One very important relationship that James had was with a cousin named Minnie Temple. Um, we will see elements of her. Minnie Temple had TB, tuberculosis, and she um, eventually died of it. She was very young, 23, I believe. But of her, James gleaned characteristics that would become elements of Isabel Archer. She died in 1870 of tuberculosis at New Rochelle, New York. James had especially valued her for what he calls, in a letter written to his brother William on March 8, the day she died, her moral spontaneity. Um, he says of her, um, let's see, what once was life is always life in one form or another. And denying that he had been in love with her, he says he never was. Now, as I said, from the biography, speculation is that Henry James was gay, but one wasn't in that era. One could be freer in Europe than that same characteristic in America, but we never have any kind of proof of it. But he says he wasn't in love with Minnie Temple. He said he also declared that no one who ever knew her can have failed to look at her future as a sadly insoluble problem. It is a problem of which the portrait can be read as an expression, though maybe not a solution. Minnie Temple, because she died so young, her life was incomplete. And the important thing for Henry James is an exploration of the many possibilities of a plot. We think we know where Isabel's going to go, and we get different elements of it, and she may choose something else. And this exploration of the incompleteness of Minnie is what is explored in Isabel. He denied that Isabel Archer is the reincarnation of Minnie Temple. He simply took the nugget from Minnie Temple of this kind of personality. He says in that little paragraph in the middle of this page, you are both right and wrong about Minnie Temple. I had her in mind, and there is in the heroine a considerable infusion of my impression of her remarkable nature. But the thing is not a portrait. Poor Minnie was essentially incomplete, and I have attempted to make my young woman more rounded and more finished. Minnie was incomplete because she never lived out her life. She died. Down at the bottom, there is no strictness in the representation by novelists of persons who have struck them in life, and there can, in the nature of things, be none. And we know that Henry James was quite an intellectual. So he contemplated this. He understood that he was taking details from his own experience, but he explored beyond that. He was trying to present the options out there. that Minnie could never experience. Once she was dead, over on the next page, the stories by which he was to make up her lack became stories in which he imagined her problematic future completed. That, again, it requires a star. In seeing her future as a sadly insoluble problem, James was inevitably thinking of marriage. So she never got to the point of marriage. Um, I have other references to Minnie. Minnie was important to Henry James. Let's see. I have so many markers that I can't. Oh, here we are. Um, I'm back in this portrait of a novel by Michael Gora. Minnie Temple was the daughter of his father's sister, Henry James's sister. She was an orphan and lived with her paternal relations. Okay, so crumbs of Minnie are appearing in Isabel Archer. But they two were in Newport, and he saw her often. Henry found her full of a vivid life, playful and possessed of a rare intellectual grace. His sister, James had a sister. Um, his sister Alice was reserved, as tightly wound as her own plaited hair. I thought that was a fabulous um, um, analogy. James had his brother William, and then two other brothers who were younger, and then Alice was the youngest of them. We'll get back to the two younger brothers because they play a small role in James's development. Well, it's probably not a small one, they're brothers. His sister, let's say, Minnie's temperament was in contrast, as open as a window in summer, and afraid of nothing she might come to by living with enough sincerity and enough wonder. Sincerity and wonder. We will see this in Isabel. You probably should write that down too. The truth is that Minnie was very much like him, like Henry. And in spite of her charm, she yearned for a sense of certainty. And she didn't have certainty. She'd had TB for years. She was sick and hemorrhaging, and um, there are references to her in some of his letters of the illness. She had an earnestness that was too full of doubt to be sanctimonious, and used her letters as an occasion for self scrutiny in a way that her more guarded cousins did not. She was maybe a bit spiky, and certainly she could shock. A picture of 1861 shows her with cropped hair, short like a boy's. She never married. She did chop off her hair, which is in 1861. No one did that. It wasn't until decades later that women wore short hair. Just saying. I'm not even sure what I would have done with mine. Um, let's see. Minnie, the future justice prefers girls who aren't so intellectually demanding. Minnie thinks he's arrogant, and at first she finds, oh, this is about I don't need to read this part. But there is another drama here too. And if in memory he made a scene around Minnie, we ourselves can make one around him, one that lies in James' own contemplation of other men. In the contrast he cannot help drawing. They are men of mind and yet also men of action, with a kind of glitter that I had no acquisition whatever to match. Um, Many, and nevertheless, its suggestion that life doesn't stop when the hero grows away, and does point to the young author's developing sense of realism. So he mourned her, and yet it became for him a nugget through which he was going to explore the potential development of her had she been able to become complete. And that's Isabel. It, but again, he was quite clear to say that Isabel is not the reincarnation of Minnie. It just was the starting point. Down at the, I'm still in this chapter about a native no country, but Howells recognized in James from the start what James remembered above all was that he had published me at once and paid me. James was trying to become independent of his family. I don't know if that, sometimes you get stuff on your computer that just is annoying. I just have to get this off of here because I don't want that in the recording. So um, he returned in 1873. You'll notice in the chronology that he goes back and forth on the steamships which allowed him to go back and forth. From Henry's point of view, however, the most important consequence of the move back to Europe might have well been given. It might well have been his growing friendship with Howells. Let's see. In December of 1866, Howells wrote to a friend that the evening before, the two men had talked for hours about their own aesthetic principles. James had had literary friendships before, but this one was different. An elective affinity between adults in which his family and their connections had played no part. Um, they sat, and James tells us that they sat together reading our stuff to each other and intellectualizing about the development. It was an active collaboration, Gora says. For their conversation was a collaboration indeed, and one that we can only recapture by reading what they wrote to and about each other for the next half century. And I'll mention this occasionally. They would have spoken of Dickens, who visited Boston in 1867, leaving James with a memory of the Englishman's all consuming eyes. And probably they spoke about audience. So Howells and he spoke about plot and audience and the elements of fiction. When I teach my freshmen about how to read fiction, one of the ways to go about it is to investigate the elements of fiction. Neither of them liked the multi-plotted novel of wait, I lost my place. Neither of them liked the multi-plotted novel of the Victorians. The twisted strands of seemingly divergent narratives that made up a book like David Copperfield and Oliver Twist, and that was Dickens' modus operandi. They wanted instead to tell a single story and to make that story's ending grow directly out of its characters rather than be imposed through the machinery of sudden or startling events. They, while both of them read Dickens and admired his writing, they were trying to diverge from that multi-plotted way of developing characters so that in page 792 the plots all come together. So they walked along the river and they would talk about plot, or rather about what their critics called plotlessness. This is where I'm going. Many people talk about plotlessness in James. It's a story about a young woman. Who makes a story about a young woman that seems as if it could go nowhere? They similarly ruled against the kind of sentimental fiction that, for readers today, is exemplified by the death scenes in Uncle Tom's Cabins. The sentimentality of it has to, they neither one of them cared for it because, remember, they are both interested in verisimilitude and the truthful treatment of things. But they took more from such novels than they would have been willing to admit. And uh, with James, it shows in the way he idealizes his heroines, idealize them so fully that he has to knock back a chaser of irony too. I thought that was hilarious. Take a shot of irony, and he does treat Isabel with some irony occasionally. We'll take a look at that. Um, as editor, And we're talking about Howells again. He was the editor, and he was serializing some or publishing two of the short stories. As editor, he tried to cajole his friend into providing the happy endings he thought their readers required. So he's still an editor, publishing short stories. James fobbed him off with the charming but inconsequential Europeans. Have we read that with this class? Um, it was something that he wrote in order to um, please the readership. But when he got to writing portrait, he developed what he and Howells had been talking about all along. Um, they did not agree about everything, but between them, they created an American novel of manners, the novel of our eastern seaboard. They essentially created it together in their collaboration. Um, Here's a couple other points that are going to play into James. As I said, my point today is rather than going through the chronology, which you all can read yourselves, I'll point out things that helped James become the writer that he was. Um, the two other brothers, they're named Wilkie and Bob. You've got such a nice fancy name, and then we have Bob. I can't make fun because my brother's name is Bob as well. Uh, they attempted using their father's wealth after the war. The two of them went off to fight in the Civil War, and Henry James did not. He had been part of a volunteer fire corps, and I think it was in Boston. Um, and he was attempting to put out a fire and of course, at the time, the way one put out a fire wasn't with pumped hoses and the like. You used buckets and you went down a line and passing the buckets, passing the buckets, passing the buckets. And he was part of a group that was doing this in a fire that was getting away from them. And it was at that moment that Henry James believes that he hurt his back. Leon Edel, somewhere, said that he thought that Henry James slipped a disc. And so he suffered from back pain from for most of his life. And Edel says, I don't know how he gets this, but he said in the later 1860s, he suffered from what Howells understood to be indigestion. How we know this next sentence, I don't even know. It was, in fact, a prolonged period of constipation. How do we even know that? I don't know. But speculative criticism. Anyway, I'm diverging a little bit, but Wilkie and Bob, the two younger brothers, had gone off to fight in the Civil War. At the time, that was the demonstration of masculinity. One went off to fight in the Civil War between 1861 and 1865, and that's what you did to demonstrate your masculinity. You did mannish things. But Henry James did not because he had this back pain and had been able to get what's it called a dispensation or I get to that what they called it, but Wilkie and Bob attempted after the war to grow cotton in Florida, hiring freed slaves as a labor force. This is post Civil War. They paid them fairly, but they had no experience of farming, and moreover encountered the forerunners of the Ku Klux Klan. Neither one of them cared for this. Eventually, they both moved to the Midwest, and I mention this because eventually they settled and married in Milwaukee. I didn't know that. Talk about a fun fact to know and tell. In the spring of 1867, William went back to Europe where he tried out a series of spas and more consequentially began his love affair with German academic life. So we've seen him go from England and then Paris, and then he went to Switzerland with this very uneven education provided to him by his father. Um, James, and this is back. Not, this book kind of jumps around a bit, but these fun facts to know and tell really illuminate our characters. James's friendship with Minnie Temple had endured and deepened in the years since that New Hampshire summer, where they were very young um, uh, and compatible. He was not in love with her, not in any physical sense, but he did love her. He found her a necessary presence, and her frank, playful independence already provided an inspiration. That's characteristics in Isabel. In Portrait, however, James took the idea of cousins marrying seriously enough to make Ralph reject it. We'll talk about Ralph um, probably next week, but remember that Ralph is also ill and consumptive. Um, James took the idea of cousins marrying seriously enough to make Ralph reject it as a bad idea and to argue well that people in his age of pulmonary weakness had better not marry at all. That's Ralph. Ralph was consumptive. Those words might have their origin in a letter Minnie sent to James in 1869 when he was already in Switzerland. I wish I were there too, she wrote, and then added that if you were not my cousin, I would write to ask you to marry me and take me with you, but as it is, it wouldn't do. So the idea of cousins marrying is rejected partly by Minnie. Um, Okay, let's see. What else do we have? Oh, at the top. Oh no, you don't know, have this picture. No, this is in Gora. This is really immensely enlightening. Mrs. James, and this is James's Henry James's mother. She wrote an account of Minnie's dying days, and he hadn't thought about poor, struggling, suffering, dying creature, the girl who now only survived in memory. And yet, given her suffering, who would have had her back to die more painfully? What an interesting concept. Of course, when people die, we want them back. Why did they have to die? But he thought to himself that it was best not that she not come back because she would lay in bed, and she was in bed for years with the TB that haunted her. And she would cough and cough and cough. I'm sure you remember in other places, like in Dickens especially, people would cough into hankies and it would be left red with blood. And that's what happened to Minnie. Um, Minnie was a victim of her own intelligence and unlikely ever to have found happiness. Important. If she had not led an incomplete life because of her intellect, she probably would never have married. And at the time, that was important. And we have seen this over and over and over that spinsters didn't get very far. You didn't want to be unmarried in your 20s. And Minnie, he thought, probably would never have completed her life, even if she had lived. Uh, he talks about her death, and the letters were perhaps a little ghoulish, only if that means that they were written by a novelist, by someone whose job is to turn life into a narrative. And that's what he did. But I belabor this point about Minnie because he himself said that Isabel is not the reincarnation of Minnie. She just provided the beginning. Let's see. Oh, the next chapter of Gora is an examination of his expatriatism and what that provided him. And I don't know if any of you have been to Europe lately, or I don't. I'm sure everybody has been to Europe in the last 10 years or so. But one thing that I noticed in returning to the United States after having been abroad for a while is the number of American flags. And that, I think, it was, at least in my perception, was provided to me by having been outside the United States, having experienced the point of view of the other. And that is this examination of why we need to live abroad in James's point of view. Expatriation made one interesting, but it also marked one off. So he was, he goes on to say, Gora says, no European novelist, he wrote in 1881, is obliged to deal in the least with America. No one would call him incomplete for ignoring it. He believed, however, that every American writer did have to take account of Europe, and while he suspected that the balance might shift, that American culture might someday become a necessary fact of European life. And I'm sure you remember in other texts we have seen that there is a condescension of Europe towards America. And I remember having said this somewhere else, that especially in beauty products, not even sure why, but if you are buying a European product, it is somehow better than an American product, skin tighteners and the like, stuff. Um, but there is this notion, if you watch commercials, and I sometimes I find commercials an interesting representation of culture. And if you watch it, in a situation where a product is being hawked as better, it's often given the term European. Well, that comes from our past, where there is a condescension. Let's see. It is a complex state, James said, being an American, and one of the responsibilities it entails is fighting against a superstitious valuation of Europe. Isn't that fascinating? Um, he would not return to America until after the 1881 publication of the Portrait of a Lady itself. Um, in the meantime, he would have written an important assessment of Hawthorne. It's kind of not our business to look at that today, but I am going to look at eventually. You should see what my room looks like. Um, Papers and books everywhere. The the Art of Fiction, which was an article written by Henry James, is we'll look at that because it does shed light on the writing process. James lifted the thought about the American in Europe and then extended it in a passage of great comic brilliance, a list of everything that in Hawthorne's day looked absent from American culture. There was this belief that American culture was not up to par because it started so late in the game. And um, this is ironic, and this is what James was saying was missing from America, the texture of American life. No state, in the European sense of the word, and indeed barely a specific national name. No sovereign, no court, no personal loyalty, no aristocracy, no church, no palaces, no castles, nor manors, nor old country houses, nor thatched cottages, or ivied ruins, no cathedrals, no Oxford, no novels, no museums, no pictures, no political society, no sporting class. Uh, not We don't have that here. In fact, um, many of you know that I moved to Cedarburg almost 2 years, almost 3 years ago. Wow. And it was fascinating for me to walk up and down the main drag in Cedarburg and look up and see the dates on the facades of some of the buildings. And for us, old is 1840. I was fascinated that um, St. Francis Borgia, which is the Catholic Church at the end of the street, was built in 1840. And because I teach history and civics in the jail, plus writing, it was interesting to me to know that that was built before the Civil War. That's old for us. We don't have castles here. That's old. Anyway, that's an aside. I just thought it was really interesting. Um, Gora goes on to say that the limitations James found in American life were limitations above all in the material it offered for the novel, and hence he had to go to Europe with his this young American girl. In America, the deposit of that history was still so thin that we very soon touched the hard substratum of nature. So we needed to take his naive, pretty sassy young American girl to Europe to explore herself. The exceptionalism of the American condition operated even in the realm of prose. Um, let's see. The social background in such works may remain abstract. The characters are often flatly emblematic, and the writer's emphasis falls instead upon an often astonishing plot that serves as the vehicle for an overarching symbolic truth. That was in the New European novels, but remember, I've already said, and we know this, that Hawthorne, James's plots are a little bit plotless. Um, Still, he needed the thickened air of history. He needed its baggage and furniture. He wanted its Louis Cans and his own overvaluation of Europe associated. He associated history itself with abroad as something America couldn't give him. Um, Later, he would wonder if that had been a mistake and encouraged our friend Edith Wharton to do New York. Remember that? Remember when we were talking about Wharton? And Wharton said that James encouraged her to explore New York. That's how this came to be. Um, to do New York, to take up the chance he had missed. Missed perhaps because of the way his father had removed his children from American life. So I'm coming full circle here. Henry James and his brother William, particularly, had this peculiar upbringing of bouncing from one country to another. Um, the senior James, their father, was always in search of a better education for his children. So sometimes they would, like when they were in Switzerland, and this is as Henry James and his brother were children, they would go from one institution or another in the same city as his father sought something different. So these, particularly these two, William and Henry, grew up with a peculiar education um, in Europe. And Henry James said one time that his upbringing taught him to see America as other. He wasn't immersed in it, but he was part of it. He found his material in dramatizing the collision of an American sensibility with all that made the old world old. That's key. The American sensibility as set in the old world. Um, let's see, what else did I want to tell you in this? Okay, let's see. Oh, he was introduced. I mentioned this before, but Gora comes back to this concept of having been introduced to the circle of French writers with whom he gathered on Sundays at the flat of Gustave Flaubert. That's where he met Zola and Maupassant. Um, I already told you this. And James was, moreover, the only important writer in English to see it from within. So remember, we've seen authors do this before. They become expatriate and then associate themselves with these parlor societies. And that's what James did. Um, let's see. 30 years after this parlor society that he became immersed in in France. 30 years later, James put that conversation into his preface to the portrait, remembering Turgenev's inspiring claim that his characters seemed to hover before him, soliciting him, interesting him, and appealing to him just as they were and by what they were. Um, so to Turgenev, his characters became real creatures. This was something that James took to heart. Plot was to him an irrelevance. It got in the way of the truth, of the emotional logic that governed his business, his people. The business of writing lay not in making his characters do anything, but rather in discovering a situation that would allow them to reveal themselves. This is James's method. Remember, this goes back to Minnie, who was incomplete. Now he has Isabel, and rather than experiencing an event, such as in what happens in Dickens, these things happen to characters. James places before Isabel alternatives, and we look at her examination of her decision making, and we wonder, what is she going to do? Um, okay, oh yeah, the project, which would become the portrait of an artist, um, would be the portrait of the character and recital of the adventures of a woman. A great swell psychologically, a great nature accompanied with many developments. That's exactly what happens. But this could not have been without the peculiar education, without his friendship and admiration of Minnie, and then her death, which made her incomplete, and then his relationship with Howells, and the verisimilitude, and his relationship and examination of characterization through Turgenev. All of these things come together. Um, he also, one of the places that he used to visit um, in Europe, it's actually in England, was this estate. I forget the name of it. And it was to become Hardwick, which is where we find our characters in the beginning. But that's another little piece that he uses to develop, and he describes it. The description that we get of the setting at the very beginning of the novel, um, which, as I said, we're not going to get to today, but we will when we begin. Um, she was there was a he had a friend with another intellectual woman whose name was Grace Norton. She was, James wrote, both right and wrong to take Minnie Temple as the original of Isabel Archer. He admitted that he had had his cousin in mind and that he had given Isabel an infusion of her remarkable nature. I think I read that already. Still, he cautioned against taking the character as a direct portrait, for poor Minnie was incomplete, and I have tried to make my young woman more. I already read that, I'm sure. I think I took the piece of paper off of it. And then he goes on. Isabel, however, gives him the impression that she has intentions of her own, and that's exactly what we will experience. She may be incomplete, but it doesn't seem to him as if the ordinary terms of a woman's life will be able to contain her. So Isabel was living with her family and then is given an income. Remember, we've heard this over and over and over. Um, He adds in the preface that he saw the character as affronting her destiny, and Isabel will indeed come face to face with her future. That verb, not confront, but affront, gains an extra force if we see Minnie as having provided a model, and James himself offers an affront to his cousin's destiny. a slap across its face, and a front that consists of trying to imagine just who she might who who she might with Isabel's chances have become. So Minnie's thread was cut so short that there is paradoxically more room for growth. For James's own portrait to diverge from the figure Grace Norton had remembered. So, still, James's imagination of Isabel's career is, in one sense, an extrapolation from Minnie's family circumstances. And Minnie lived at this place called, um, she no, that was Grace who lived in this place that was to become Hardwick. And he says of it, it is a Tudor building. Remember, we don't have any Tudor buildings. Well, you probably didn't forget that. A good deal bruised and defaced in Cromwell's wars, some 40 miles upstream from London. The words come from the novel, but the facts are confirmed by architectural historians. And later, in the first several chapters, we also see Isabel and Ralph paddling in a boat up and down the Thames. The Thames runs placidly here, and in the novel's early chapters, James describes Ralph and Isabel as spending some of their time in a rowboat. Um, in a 1906 article in Country Life, claims, in fact, that there is no more beautiful reach of the river than upon which the Hardwick terraces look down. So, like many of James's personal experiences, pieces of it will appear in the novel. And you can imagine, I went to Badger Link and I typed in portrait of an artist, and I think I got about 1,000 hits because there's so much written. And we're not, I'm not going to do that part this time. We're not going to do this. Okay. Oh, here's some additional points about George Eliot. Um, he admired Middlemarch. Um, he admired George Eliot above all other British novelists. He went to school on her as he did on Turgenev, and as he did not on Dickens. Her work shaped his, and to understand him, we need to understand both what he took from her and what he resisted. And let's see. What he took from her was this psychological development, but he also rejected, um, let's see, in 1866, the very young critic lamented her decision to run the plot of Adam Bede on past its climactic pitch. Okay, I'm going to try not to give away the ending. To tie the book off in the last 50 pages. If you've read Adam Bede lately, um, I haven't read it in a while, but it ties up the plot. And this is something that James is rejecting and has a denouement at the end. Remember the bell that represents the development and conclusion of a novel. He lamented that it took her 50 pages to solve the novel. Anyone could see what probably would happen next. Did the novel really have to spell it out? That's an interesting point. That's really interesting because one of the things that has been criticized in Henry James is there's no absolute conclusion to some of his works. He thought that Henry James made things too easy for the readers. The ideal reader, he wished her pages had implied, would be someone engaged enough for him to deduce it for himself. So he admired her above everybody else in her ability to do a psychological portrait, but he resisted her way of um, concluding a plot. It was too much. He wanted the reader, he wanted us to participate in that. The ideal reader he wished her pages had implied would be someone engaged enough to deduce it for himself, an active, inference drawing reader for whom no meaning needed to be underlined. Okay, I'm going to stop with that because I don't want to give away the ending. His own books would be different. He thought she gave English fiction a claim to both rigor and respect that it had earlier lacked. But he did not simply want to fill her chair. He had gone once after George Eliot died and had met with her husband, and her chair was empty because she had now died. And just an interesting aside about George Eliot, she, of course, had one relationship and never married. And then that broke up. And she'd been living with him, perished the thought, in Europe. But then she really took up with her husband, who she then married. But the husband was 20 years younger than she is. But anyway, then she died. And her husband invited James to come to visit. And the husband offered George Eliot's chair. But James did not want to simply occupy George Eliot's chair. He wanted to go beyond that. He said, but he did not simply want to fill her chair and hoped his stories would have less brain than Middlemarch, but have more form. James gave in Portrait of a Lady his own heroine the centrality he felt she deserved. We're going to see that. Write that down if you're a note taker. She is central. When she is not in the room, people talk about her. Not talk about her behind her back, but she is the center. Isabel isn't always on stage, and she isn't the only character whose mind James allows us to enter, but she's what the other characters talk about, even or especially when she's off the page. Scientific is an Eliot word, one we can associate with the author, who in Middlemarch took her metaphors from physiology and optics. Expectant is, however, all James. The word of the novelist who asks us to wonder with Ralph about just what will Isabel do? And that is the question. What will she do? And Ralph asks that question when we get to the novel itself. What will she do? Not what will happen to her, which is Dickens, but what will she do? And that's where the development of the novel comes in. That is what I have for you today. I'm about an hour and a half, I think. And next week we will, let's see, I finished everything I needed to tell you. Oh, one other thing. Okay, this book, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm trying. I'm trying very carefully to steer clear of the ending. So yes, I'm going to stop there, and we will pick up next week with unless I think that's it. Mhm. Yeah, I have a few other things that I'm going to tell you about next week, having to do with thematics. And if you have not started the novel, the beginning of the novel is curious because it establishes a lot of the things that James is going to do, but it doesn't begin with Isabel. She walks on stage a couple pages in, which is interesting. But we'll look at that. I don't want to get into this and then have to stop midstream. So we'll stop here. If anyone has questions or comments, feel free. You can email me. It's on that. It's on the syllabus, I think. I have one somewhere, but I forgot where. And so have a good week, and we will talk again next week. I do intend to go 100 pages at a time. Essentially, it's really 88 pages a class. So I'm not going to go, as I said in the beginning, line by line. I'm going to talk about various thematics, but we are going to have to move a little bit more quickly through the text than we might in a shorter work. So pay attention to thematics as we go, and pay attention to the things that I've talked about today that created the Isabel Archer she was to become. So have a nice week. Shoot me questions if you want. And that's all.